Emma says anytime you give a shiur, you should give a hagdama and say that azay verstehe. I can only teach you what I understand. What I don't understand and what I don't know, I cannot teach you. Which means to say that sof kol sof, the maamar is eisies harav, eisies machkim, this is the Rebbe's Teda. And when someone says a pshat, a hezber, a havana, it's whatever it is. Hopefully you try your best to give a chavim amitasa shal davar. You don't have a kavana to make a gefälschte pshat, an incorrect pshat. And this is always true, but it is especially true in the way I'm going to learn with you this maamar. I'm prefacing by saying that I've learned this maamar more than once, and I've also talked it over with several people. Because I understand, I agree that the way I'm going to learn with you the maamar is perhaps a bit pretentious, a little bit. I'm sort of allowing myself to think what's the pshat in the maamar, but I hope that I'm telling you something which is emes and not something which is hepech emes. I certainly don't mean to mislead. When you learn the maamar, that is a good fanander kleiben. Let me preface by saying this. You could say that this maamar of Lamed Beis is a continuation of the last point of the maamar of Yud Beis. It's as if the Rebbe said a maamar Yud Beis, and in that maamar the Rebbe spoke Kama Pchinis, Kama in Yonim. The highest point, the deepest nekuda of the maamar that the Rebbe said in Tafshin Yud Beis is the yesod, the basis of this entire maamar. And now we discussed Yud Beis. We discussed last week, and we discussed like this. Yud Beis says that you could bring a korban, and that bringing a korban has a whole seder. Moreover, Yud Beis said that when you could bring a korban, even if you're a Rasha, even if you're lower than the madrega of Beinani, mikemu b'chem adav atoli, even a Rasha could bring a korban, but before a Rasha could bring a korban, he has to do tshuva. And after he does tshuva and he becomes, for the sake of argument, a Beinani, then he has a whole seder of Aveda. He does the bedika, and he's misakin all of his mumim, and then he takes out the chayes, and he's makriv the gashmis for Aveda Hashem. The other maamar also added that when a yid is makriv a korban, the Eibishter helps him. The Eibishter gives him a eishel mailo. That when you're makriv a korban, the korban could go not in a good way, it could go to who knows where. The Eibishter brings a fire maila that preserves and guarantees that the korban should go only l'makom aroi. And you may recall, Shalheves Yudke is not just Shalheves, it's not even Shalheves Akshura B'Gachelet, it's Shalheves Shavateicha B'Gachelet. But then the maamar went deeper. And the maamar said that a korban is everything that was said about a korban until now still has a shaykhis to seichel. To verstehen, Havana was sagen. Even though the whole idea of being makav a korban, which includes being makav Devish Abahamas as Lamaylam and Aseichel, but being makav a korban and a madrega of Lamaylam and Aseichel is Al Pi Seichel. The Seichel said that you should be makav the Devish Abahamas. So the Seichel said you should be makav the Devish Abahamas, then the Lamaylam and Aseichel of a korban is also Al Pi Seichel. This is all in the maamar of Tafshin Yud Beis. And at the very end of Perek Dalet of the maamar of Tafshin Yud Beis, the last 10-15 lines, the Rebbe adds a Nocha Nekudah. And he says, no, there's another madrega to korban. And the other madrega to the korban is L'maylam and Aseichel Legamri. And if you remember that maamar, the Rebbe says this is Ben, which is higher than Eved. It's L'maylam and Aseichel Legamri. What makes a korban L'maylam and Aseichel Legamri? When you are sacrificing yourself to the Eibishter for no return. You're sacrificing yourself to the Eibishter, and not the pshat, I'm giving God, God should give me back. I'm giving myself to the Eibishter, and that's all there is, giving myself to the Eibishter. In other words, B'chlal and mitzvahs is a ratzav v'sheiv, I give and I get. Karbonis are distinct, that the inyan of a korban is I'm giving myself away to the Eibishter, there's nothing in it for me, there's no return, so to speak. This argues that Rebbe is the L'maylam and Aseichel of a korban has no shaychus whatsoever. In other words, the idea of making a bedika and shechting and giving the gashmias or even doing tshuva and the eishal mailo, all of these things have at least an indirect shaychus to seichel. You can explain them indirectly. But the final point that the Rebbe makes at Nisaf Peirik Dal, the Maamar Tashni Beis, which is that what's the aspect of a carbon, which is the Maamar sacrifice. And the meaning of sacrifice is, like it says in this Maamar from the Kutatera, carbon is me'esies rikovin, ratting, bittel for the Mebishin. There's no return for me. You fast forward 20 years, you get the Tafshan Lamed Beis, and this idea of carbon, l'cha'eda, is the yesod, is the basis of this whole Maamar. And this is how this Maamar develops, how this Maamar goes. There's Peirik Aleph of Basi Legani, and there's Peirik Beis of Basi Legani. What's the difference between Peirik Aleph of Basi Legani and Peirik Beis of Basi Legani? Peirik Aleph of Basi Legani is v'asul l'mikdash v'shamachanti b'seichem, making the Eibush to the Beis HaMikdash. What's Peirik Beis of Basi Legani? Achas ha'avedes ha'ikris shehayu b'mikdash she'avedes ha'karbanos. Now this is the Beis HaMikdash, bring karbanos. Peirik Aleph means building God a home. Peirik Beis is serving God within that home. And of course, if you learned the beginning of the Maamar, Peirik Aleph, Peirik Beis, Peirik Gimel of the Lamed Beis Maamar, it's a pilpul. And the pilpul says you should know every Jew could do both tasks. Every Jew could build the Eibush to the home, not just the Shiva Tzadikim. Anybody can build the Eibush to the house. And every Jew could bring a carbon within that house. In other words, ideas of Peirik Aleph, which is Dira b'tachtoinim v'asul l'mikdash v'shachanti v'soichem, anybody could do. And the idea of Achas Avedis Ha'ikrish Hayv and Mikdash Avedis HaKarbonis also anybody can do. He's medaktik and medayik. There's a lot of very edel in Yonah in the first program of the Maamar that we need Moshe Rabbeinu. The Chach Shafilu, anybody can do it. But we need Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu built the Mishkan. And in building the Mishkan, he gave a koyach for any Jew to come after him and contribute to building the Mishkan. Moshe Rabbeinu was Makiv Karbonis. And Moshe Makiv Karbonis contributes that any Jew after Moshe Rabbeinu could be Makiv Karbonis. Or to say it in different words, when we build a Mishkan, we're Mamshech Ikir Shechina. When we're Makiv Karbonis, we're Mamshech a higher Madrega of Ikir Shechina. And any Yid could build the Beis HaMikdash with the Keach of Moshe Rabbeinu. And any Yid could be Makiv Karbonis with the Keach of Moshe Rabbeinu. So Peirik Aleph talks about building a Beis HaMikdash. And Peirik Beis is bringing a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. So the Rebbe says the difference between building a Beis HaMikdash and being Makiv a carbon is the difference between Ishapcha and Iskafia. Now we would assume first comes Iskafia, then comes Ishapcha. Here's Faket. Building the Beis HaMikdash is Ishapcha. Building the Beis HaMikdash is Ishapcha. In the Beis HaMikdash being Makiv a carbon is Iskafia. It's backwards. In other words, Iskafia comes after Ishapcha, not before Ishapcha. Peirik Aleph of the Maamar talks about Ishapcha, and Peirik Beis of the Maamar talks about Iskafia. Why? Because what are you doing when you're making the Eibush to the house? What are you doing? You're taking a piece of this world and you're transforming it into godliness. You're taking yourself, you're transforming yourself into godliness. What's happening to you? Are you disappearing? No, pum faket. You're becoming more emes. Before you were who knows what, and now you're a dira le'yizbarech v'tachtenim, you're a kol echad ve'echad, you're a mishkan or mikdash le'yizbarech. So Peirik Aleph of Basi Legani that describes making the Eibush to the Beis HaMikdash. And more specifically, that every Yid makes himself a Beis HaMikdash. And Mamshech Ikir Shechina, this is called Ishapcha. You're not disappearing. You're not becoming ois. You're not becoming bottle. Your Metzias is becoming Getlachkeit. Now, forgive me, but what I'm about to say doesn't say in the Maamar. These are my own words now. This you could explain up Yiseichel. This is what I'm connecting Lamed Beis to Yud Beis. It makes sense. The Eibush made a world. You're not destroying the world. The Eibush made a person. You're not destroying the person. You're taking this world. And you're taking this person and you're making him into something better. You're making him into godliness. It's hapcha. Then you get to Peirik Beis. Peirik Beis is Iskafia. How does the Rebbe know that Peirik Beis is Iskafia? So the Rebbe shows us, like in the very, very beginning of Peirik Beis of the Rebbe, And then at the very end of the Perek Beis in the Maamar, in the beginning and in the end, the Frierdiker Rebbe uses the lashon iskafia hamevi lidei ishapcha. Iskafia that brings to ishapcha. And at the end of the Perek it says iskafia ubefrat hamevi lidei ishapcha. Iskafia, and especially brings to ishapcha. Now, any yeshiva bacher learns this Perek. Iskafia hamevi lidei ishapcha sounds like ishapcha is better than iskafia. Iskafia ubefrat hamevel de ishapcha, which is one of the footnotes. Footnote 29. It sounds like
that ishapcha is better than iskafia.
Says the Rebbe, no, punkt verkehrt. That when the Frierdiker Rebbe says iskafia hamevel de ishapcha, iskafia ubefrat hamevel de ishapcha, you know what he's saying? That there's an iskafia which is not bringing to ishapcha. Yeah, normally iskafia is step 1, ishapcha is step 2. I got a secret for you, there's a different kind of iskafia. And the different kind of iskafia, the fetish does not bring to ishapcha. No. There's an iskafia that's a tachas, that's an end. And the iskafia, which is the tachas, which is an end, is higher than ishapcha. In other words, bringing a korban is higher than building a Beis HaMikdash. Because building a Beis HaMikdash is ishapcha. You're taking something from the Gashmizdika world, you're not destroying it, you're making it godly. That makes sense. But then there's something else. Bringing a korban. What's a korban? Sacrifice. What's like sacrifice? I am not. That's it. First I was a person, and now I'm a korban. This is called a skafia. So the Rebbe is medayik very carefully in the Frierdiker Rebbe's Maamar, and he says Perek Beis is not speaking about the skafia mevel de ishapcha. Yeah, he mentions skafia mevel de ishapcha, and he also mentions in the Pnim that in Perek Aleph it says the skafia sitrach. But the Rebbe holds Perek Aleph is building a Beis HaMikdash is hapcha. Perek Beis is a korban which is iskafia, and emphatically iskafia which is not mevi deis hapcha. Breaking yourself for the Eibishter, where the end is I'm broken. Finished. And then the plot thickens. Then it gets even deeper. Perek Beis says, Perek Beis of the Basi Legani is no longer talking about building the Eibishter Beis HaMikdash, but being makar of a korban. Sacrificing yourself to the Eibishter. And sacrificing yourself to the Eibishter doesn't mean I become a bigger Metzias. It means poshet and prost, I become ois. And the Rebbe says the biggest chiddush of all. All of us understand that everything exists begashmias, and everything exists beruchnias. What is begashmias for Asoli Mikdash? Building a Beis HaMikdash. What is beruchnias for Asoli Mikdash? And everybody understands that the Asoli Mikdash is less than building a Beis HaMikdash, right? Now, Karbonis, same story. You have a korban begashmias. What's a korban begashmias? You take a behema gashmias and you shecht it and you do all the inyanim and you make it abba mizbech. It's the biggest thing possible. What's a korban beruchnias? Bittel. What's a korban beruchnias? Avedas atfilah. So ask any person, which is preferred? A korban begashmias or a korban beruchnias? What's he going to say? The Pashas gashmias. Just like building a Beis HaMikdash. Building a Beis HaMikdash begashmias is preferred to building a Beis HaMikdash beruchnias. So bringing a korban begashmias should be better than a korban beruchnias. The Rebbe, nope, nicht das. In building a Beis HaMikdash, in his hapcha, transforming a house into a house, a mishkan l'machan la'yizbarech, is a bigger thing than making yourself into a Beis HaMikdash. But when it comes to a korban, the korban that a person makes in himself, here he says that the korban of yourself is greater than the korban of the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Does anybody know why? Why is the personal korban greater than the korban of a behemoth? What does the Frierdiker Rebbe say in his Maamar? Let's talk about the Frierdiker Rebbe. How does the Frierdiker Rebbe start Perek Beis? How does he start it? Achas ha'avodos shahaya b'mikdash hu yinavei tzakabonis. One of the jobs in the Beis HaMikdash was karbonis. So the Rebbe says in footnote 22, Achas doesn't mean one. Achas means the only one. Achas doesn't mean one. Achas means the einzige. It brings Shittas HaRambam, karbonis, finished. Achas avodah shahoy b'tevakabon. Then he adds a few more words. Shu avodah ruchnis shebenefesh. It's a ruchnis de avodah. That karbonis is a ruchnis de avodah. Now, In Peidik Yud Beis, in Tafshin Yud Beis, I'm sorry. When the Rebbe said that Karbonis is an Aveda Ruchnis, how did the Rebbe explain it? Shu Gam Ken Aveda Ruchnis. You guys learned Yud Beis, you know. It's also an Aveda Ruchnis. Of course, Karbonis is a Gashmi, is the Kaveda. But when the Beis HaMikdash is destroyed, there's no Gashmi, is Karbonis, just Ruchnik Karbonis. Comes again the Rebbe in Lamed Beis says, no. It's not the Pshat that also Baruch the Makav HaKarban. Dafke Baruch the Makav HaKarban. Why? Look at Sivov, please. Look inside Sivov from the beginning. Sivov. For Yuvan Zebe Hegdim. Now this Sivov is really the heart of this Maimed, Ladaiti. Sivov is the heart of this Maimed. We can explain it by prefacing. Mashakosav Bahamayim B'tchel Sapedik, what the Friedrich Rebbe says. Sha'avoida shahoisa b'mishkan u'mikdash, the karbonis that are brought in the existing Beis HaMikdash, Hiyaveda the iskafia, bending yourself, Hamavil the ishapcha, which brings to ishapcha. And as I told you before, the Rebbe holds that it's not the iskafia is lower than ishapcha. Iskafia is an end. After the iskafia of a cotton, there's no ishapcha. Right? The beginning of the Maamar, he says, that it's this combination of iskafia. Aleph says iskafia is hapcha. For us, only makes you take a house, you make it godly, you're transforming it. And the Rebbe continues, the Hagam Shemei Vishames HaMaimir, although the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe, brings in Peidik Aleph, and Peidik Aleph talks about his hapcha. Peidik Aleph talks about making a Gashmi, a home, a godly home, taking a person and making a Beis HaMikdash for the Meibishten. Itake says, Kadeskafi Sitter Acharo. Turn to page Chavav. In Peidik Aleph of Basi Legani, there's no doubt that his hapcha is the tachlis and is higher than his kafi. To be sure, when you learn Peidik Aleph of the Friedrich Rebbe's Maamar, which talks about building the Beis HaMikdash. Building the Beis HaMikdash is not this kafia. Building the Beis HaMikdash is this hapcha. Hu ba'hamayla, this hapcha, second life on top of page Chavav. When you transform darkness into light, nasa yisen he'ed is an additional line. But that's Peidik Aleph. Peidik Aleph is dira b'tachtoinim. Peidik Aleph is v'asol in mikdash. Peidik Aleph is seichalachat v'achad miyisrael. Make yourself godly. Peidik Beis is iskafia, not the hapcha. Not the iskafia that brings to his hapcha. Iskafia. What does iskafia mean? Sacrifice yourself to the Eibishter. When you sacrifice yourself to the Eibishter, what happens? What happens is nothing. You're not. That's Peidik Beis. And that's how the Rebbe explains karbonis. And accordingly, the Rebbe comes up with a moedendike gedank. Ube Peidik, ze Peidik sheni, 3 lines on the top of the page. Now the Beis HaMikdash is built. You're serving Hashem within it. Oy, the Rebbe says something altogether different. The job in the Beis HaMikdash, and on this you have footnote 29 that I showed you before, that even though he says Mavil Deis Hapcha, Peidik Beis is again not Deis Hapcha, but how the Iskafia is a tachlis b'fnei atzma. The Rebbe explains himself. This is very clear. You'll see explicitly what I said in the Maamar. What is accomplished through a korban? It is a higher inyan. Which is even higher than building a Beis HaMikdash. Who is as follows? Ki. When you're making a Beis HaMikdash, who inyan is hapcha, you're transforming. The person and the world are transformed to be mikdash le'yizbarech, a sanctuary to the Meibishten. So what happens? Before you were a zlob, and now you're a keli for lakus. So you're more mitzias or less mitzias? More mitzias. What's the chiddush in karbonis? Sheba mudgoch gam ha'inyan diskafia. In the case of a korban, the emphasis is not that I'm becoming a bigger mitzias. I'm sacrificing myself to the Eibishter. Ultimately, through iskafia, you bring down the oiri nas yesem shachades avedis is hapche, but that's not your kavanah. Your kavanah is bit. Look, the Rebbe Azoi, well, pizeh, yesh lo Yosef. Now I want to say something very, very radical. The Rebbe says, Bazeh shemavayer ubaruch, when the Frierdiker Rebbe in Pedig Beis talks about karbonis, he doesn't talk about gashmizik karbonis. He talks about the karbonis ruchni. Ha'inyan daveis karbonis mishvaveis ha'adam in a person. You know why he does it? Listen to this. Ki bekarbonis kipshutam nike begil hirak ha'inyan des hapcha. When there was a Beis HaMikdash standing, and you took a behema and sacrificed in the Beis HaMikdash, you were not destroying an animal. You were transforming the animal. A korban begashmis is his hapcha. The idea that the purpose of a korban is simply sacrifice. No return. I'm getting nothing back. It's not, I'm sacrificing myself to the Eibush, I'm becoming a bigger person. I'm sacrificing myself to the Eibush that I am becoming nothing. Is niker yeser ba'avedes hakarbonos shebenefesh ha'adam. In other words, where do you see true bittul? Where do you see, to use the language of the Maamar of Tafshin Yud Beis, l'mayla min ha'seichel legamri, a service of Hashem where there's no seichel whatsoever, not in a korban gashmi. In a korban gashi, you're taking godliness and you're making it into making flesh gashmi is making it into godliness. In other words, it's not becoming ice. He's becoming more. He's becoming different. He's becoming better. But when a yid makes himself into a korban, when a yid makes himself into a korban, that's true iskafia. That's the ideal korban. Because what is a Jew doing when he's doing iskafia? He's in effect sacrificing himself to the Eibishter. There's no return. First of all, the basic chiddush is that Perek Aleph and Perek Beis, if I understand it correctly, are introducing us to the two dimensions of why the Eibishter created the world. One dimension of why the Eibishter created the world, which we'll call the reasonable dimension, is to make this world into a godly place. The other dimension where the Eibishter created the world, which is this higher than reasonable dimension, is why did the Eibishter create the world? I should sacrifice myself to the Eibishter. But there's a bigger chiddush. In making this world godly, the Beis HaMikdash is better than my local shul. The Beis HaMikdash is a much more godly home than my shtibel. But in a korban, the human korban is more of a korban than the animal korban. Because in the animal korban, hetzach fart is hapcha. When I shecht and sacrifice an animal, I'm not destroying, I'm transforming. When I shecht and sacrifice myself, I'm sacrificing. Kumtois, that if we were to divide the message of Basi Legani into these two themes, making the world godly, which is making the world bigger, and sacrificing myself to the Eibishter, the idea of sacrificing myself to the Eibishter is the sacrifice of a person, not of a behemoth. Because when a person sacrifices himself, it's from bit. So this is really, this Perek Vav that I just read with you is the nekuda of the Basi Legani Tafshlamet Beis. That Perek Beis is talking about karbonis, which is a skafia not hamavil deis a skafia stam. What's a skafia bittel? And a skafia stam, which is skafia bittel, is in Avedas Ha'adam.
And as I told you in the beginning, that this entire Maamar is sort of connected to the highest point in the Maamar of Tafshin Yud Beis, at the very end of Perek Daled, where he talks about doing mitzvahs completely l'mayla min hatam.
Omnam be'emes ein ze maspek adayin, lias lifnei havaya, right? Aval tachlos aveda hi. When a person sacrifices himself for the Eibishter, shaloi tir b'shvil hateva ilui, ki im b'chdei l'kayam ratzon elyon. This last point in this base is the yesod of the whole Lamed Beis. Now, but I'm going to jump around. I don't know if I'm right for jumping around. In other words, but it seems to me that this is the way you have to learn this Maamar. Let's, so to speak, reset the stage, and then we'll continue the shmuas. Perek Beis Basi Legani now is about iskafia, bittul to the Eibishter, sacrifice, not return, not what I'm getting back, but what I'm giving. I'm giving myself away to the Eibishter. And when is a person giving to the Eibishter the most? In tefillah, right? In avodah ruchnis. The ruchnis dike korban is more than the gashmi dike korban, because in the gashmi dike korban hetzach fart is hapch. Fine. Go forward to page Lamed, which is the middle of Sif Tes. It says, now, if we accept the initial premise, which is that a ruchni yizdika carbon has more of a quality of bittul than a gashmi yizdika carbon, when you sacrifice yourself to the Eibishter, you're getting nothing in return. Kumta is that in tefillah there's more bittul than in a carbon. Now let's read inside. In conjunction with everything we said before, based on the yesod which was established in Peirik Vav of the Maamar, that we're talking about bittul. What is bittul in Avedas Nefesh Adam, Avedas Atfilo? Adam ki yakev mikem. You need the neshama lamati zerech aliyah. The neshama comes down to go to a higher level. And what's the taich to go to a higher level? Sheyihi inyan hala amilmat alamayla. The neshama should ascend higher. Lot seif mimitziyusa, to go out of its mitzias. Uli kol will be aiding self to come and call it in the Eibishter. Says the Rebbe, v'aliyah shalahi. When does a neshama have an aliyah? When does a neshama achieve a bittul b'tefillah? In davening. Why in davening the tefillos keneged karbonos tiknu. Tefillos are karbonos. So if you want to understand what is the ruchni zekaveda b'nefesh ha'adam, you have to analyze tefillah. And he brings a teres of Baal Shem Tov. The teres of Baal Shem Tov says, and the Baal Shem Tov, of course, was talking about himself. When a person finishes davening and he remains alive, it's a nes. Why? Because when you're davening, you sacrifice the Meibishter. If you sacrifice the Meibishter, you're finished. You're sacrificed. Considering the kavanas during davening, and the fact that a person davens and finishes davening and he's still alive, continues that Ebony says, this is the I am saying, the Baal Shem Tov is saying, that through tefillah you should achieve kaleis hanefesh. Is kriyat tefillah hu inyan ha'law. Davening is ascending. Lotzeis mimitziyu, so they go out of your mitzias. Vilikol will be himself to be included in godliness. Bedugmas hakorban, like a korban shaya nisraf, which was burnt. V'nichol, that included be'eshal ma'il, the fire from above. Okay, Rabbi say, here comes the vart that I'm going to share with you, which I don't know if it's correct, but I think it's correct. There's two concepts. One concept is bittul to the Eibishter. Another concept is kaleis hanefesh to the Eibishter. What's the difference between bittul to the Eibishter and kaleis hanefesh to the Eibishter? What's the difference between bittul to the Eibishter and kaleis hanefesh to the Eibishter? I can assure you, if you learn this maamar, what is given a sach gishmakel, over the line as it. What's the difference between bittul to the Eibishter and kaleis hanefesh to the Eibishter? The difference between bittul to the Eibishter and kaleis hanefesh is a pashta zach. Bittul to the Eibishter is you stop existing. Kaleis hanefesh to the Eibishter is not you stop existing. You become a higher existence. Before you were a person, and now this person is Kohen and Insof. In other words, just like in Peirik Vov, the Rebbe said, what's the difference between a ruchni yizdika korban and a gashmi yizdika korban? When you bring a ruchni yizdika korban, is a skafia, ois, I don't exist anymore. When you bring a gashmi yizdika korban, the goal you have is hapcha, the transformation of an animal into kedusha. Now the Rebbe says that in davening itself there's two aspects. This is how I see it. One aspect in davening is when you daven to Eibush, you stop existing. Bittul. Another aspect of Eibush is that when you daven, you are nichol and elakus. You become included in godliness. In other words, in davening itself, there's al derech haskafi and hashapcha. The skafi in davening is you stop existing. You become bittul to the Eibush. It's hapcha in davening is you become transformed and you become a godly mitzvah. When the Baal Shem Tov says that kaleis hanefesh is halo lotes mimtziyusei v'likolo be'erein sof, that's the second concept. That when you daven, you become godliness. But there's a first concept, and the first concept is what the Rebbe says in the next paragraph. And if my pshat in this maamar is correct, The Rebbe says like this, there's two inyanim. There's before davening and there's during davening. What's the difference between before davening and during davening? Before davening is ein eindim l'spal ela metech keved reish. Before you daven, you have to have bittul. Then you have davening. What happens when you daven? You become kolul and elikus. Which is higher? The bittul before davening, where you become ois, or the bittul during davening, you become kolul and elikus? So from the perspective of Iskafia, if you look at Perek Beis of this Maamar, as the Rebbe does, that this is about Iskafia. And Iskafia doesn't mean how I'm becoming transformed into godliness, but how I'm sacrificing myself to the Eibishter. The place, in other words, the highest point of davening is the davening that you do before you're davening. Why? Because the davening that you're doing before you're davening is bittul, ois mitzias. The davening of davening is kalei sanefesh, fakert to becoming more mitzias. Like the famous story that Tzemach Tzedek, there's a chassid came to the Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek and he complained. He says, Rebbe, I make all my hachonos l'tefillah, I do my learning chassidus, I do my meditation, but I come to davening, I have no koyach. The engine is out of steam. I can't daven, I have no koyach. So Tzemach Tzedek says to him, "Was art es dir, as du davenst fahren daven? Why does it bother you that you daven before davening?" The Rebbe says this before davening and this during davening. And again, I'm going with my Havana in the Maamar. I'm jumping around, but I'm telling you how I understand the Maamar. I could very much be wrong, because I'm giving myself a license to cut and paste a little bit too much. And I'm admitting it up front. I'm telling it to you straight. But if I'm correct, what the Rebbe is saying is Hezachai. There is the richness of bittul. That's karbonis. There is the plainness of bittul. That's tefillah. Within tefillah itself, there's two inyanim. There's the richness of tefillah. That's tefillah. There is the plainness of tefillah. And that's koidev tefillah. Look at the bottom of the page. It says in the Gemara, it says in the Mishnah, the Gemara named him Uspal, Mitech Keved Reish. A Yid is now daven to the Eibishter unless he has Keved Reish, a heavy head, bitl. Upirush Rashi says in Shas, Hachna v'shiflus. Before you daven, you have to bottle the Eibishter. And the Rebbe explains the kivan she'inyan atfilahu. What is the concept of davening? Sheyet say mimitziyu say v'nichol beidin sof bitl. What does davening mean? You're going out of your mitzias and become included in Ein Sof, which is bittul. Top of page Lamed Aleph now. Lochein, therefore, gam hachana l'tfilah, the preparation for davening, hi hachna v'shipos is a brokenness bittul. But look at the difference in the two bittles. The bittul of davening is hiskalus Ein Sof. The bittul of before davening is Hachna v'shifl. Which is a better bittul? From a perspective of his hapcha, davening, you're becoming one with godliness. But from a perspective of his skafia, which is the point of Perek Beis, as the Rebbe explained in Perek Vav, the highest point of davening is the davening you do before you daven. Why? Because now it's not rich, now it's not inspired, now it's not illuminated, it's bittul. And he explains, Shabittul the tefillah, the bittul during davening, hu b'tadakir of the lakus, I get close to the Meibish. In other words, Shenirgish be'ha'ili v'afla Ein Sof, I feel the loftiness and the wondrousness of Ein Sof. Shalachein eitali kolba when included in the Ein Sof. Aber v'abittul shelifnei atfilah, the bittul before davening, hu shemismarmer, a person is bitter, al richuk, because he's far away from the Eibush. I'm in the darkness, but in that darkness, what do I have? A sacrifice to the Meibish. And from the perspective of bittul she'eini eskafia she'eini mevil deis hapcha, this is the highest point. Bittul dit filo, the bittul in davening is habittul the kaleis hanefesh shu nichlal velakus. It's a bittul of being included in godliness. The bittul shekoidem atfila hu achna v'shiflos. The bittul before davening is a bittul, and I am proposing to you that according to the yesod, the basis of this Maamar, bittul koidem atfila is greater than bittul in tefillah, because there's no hisreimavos. I'm not being included in godliness. And the Rebbe spells it out. Interessante Sache. he brings two Maamrim from the middle Rebbe of Tzemach Tzedek. This is page Lamed Aleph and Lamed Beis. Side the middle Rebbe, inside the Tzemach Tzedek, try to describe the bittul before davening. The bittul before davening. And the bittul before davening, as I'm explaining it to you, is not the richness of being included in godliness. It's the sense of lowliness, brokenness, that I have no connection to godliness. But there's a difference between the two Maamrim. And the Rebbe is medayek. He analyzes. What's the difference between how the middle Rebbe describes the brokenness before davening and how the Tzemach Tzedek describes the brokenness before davening? What's the difference? If you look in Sif Yud, so by the middle Rebbe it says, the third line into Sif Yud, Sheyizboinen ba'oitzem pchisusei v'goydel richukei v'chulu. The middle Rebbe describes bittul before davening. A person should look at himself and say, "Who am I? I'm nothing. Ich bin gar nicht. I'm absolutely nothing. I am nothing." Turn to page number Beis now. Second line from the top of the page. And now we're doing the Tzemach Tzedek's bittul kedem atfila. What does he say? Ha-cheshben, the tachlis ha-yerida, the brias ha-elam. When I calculate how low the worlds have fallen, va-tachlis, the yeridas nishmos ha-elam hazeh, and the purpose of which neshama came into this world. A yid is standing before davening. If you're standing before davening, the aved is bittul. But the middle Rebbe says before davening, how do you experience bittul? Think how you're nothing. Tzemach Tzedek is also, a yid is standing before davening, and the Tzemach Tzedek says, think about, you want to have bittul, how? Think about you are nothing in terms of fulfilling your mission. What's the difference between saying I am nothing because I'm junk, or I am nothing because I haven't fulfilled my mission? So the Rebbe says, when a person says I am nothing because I am nothing, there's no positive aspect in that. There's no feeling of upliftedness. I'm garnished, I'm a shmata, I'm nothing. That is pure bittul. On the other hand, when I say I'm nothing, but not I'm nothing because I'm nothing because I haven't achieved my purpose. When a person says I'm nothing because I haven't achieved my purpose, that means that the shaykh has to a purpose. And in as much as the shaykh has to a person, he's a something. He's a big something. So the Rebbe says, even in the koyve deroishe koydem atfila, you have two beginners. In other words, first of all, the difference between before davening and during davening is that before davening I'm bittul. And that's this maamar, it's kafir. Sacrifice to Hashem, no return. During davening, it's kalei nefesh. Kalei nefesh doesn't mean I'm losing myself. Kalei nefesh means I am being transformed into godliness. So in terms of his hapcha, in terms of richness, davening is a much greater inyan than the bittul kedem atfila. But then the Rebbe says, in the pre-davening preparation is also two beginners. When a person stands before davening, and before davening, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to feel bitter and low and nothing, insignificant. As opposed to during davening, we're supposed to feel included in the Rebbe. Says Rebbe, if I feel low because I haven't finished my mission, I'm not truly feeling low. Because the association between my lowliness and my mission is uplifting. Because my mission makes me great. But when I feel low in my lack of, not the lack of mission, because ich bin gar nicht, that's the epitome of bittul. So this is how we're going to learn this Maamar Basi Legani. We're going to learn the Maamar Basi Legani. Again, it's the yesod of the Maamar is Perek Vav, as I explained to you. And what the Rebbe says in Perek Vav is that iskafia, the bittul of karbonis, is found more in the Aveda Ruchnis, more in what a person does in his own personal life than the sacrifice of a korban. Because when you're sacrificing a korban, there is hapcha. You're not destroying the animal, you're transforming the animal, you're making the animal godly. When you're bittling yourself, what's left? Nothing is left. How does that translate in Avodas Atfila? Eibich bin nicht ungerecht, if I'm not wrong. It's dafka, the preparation before davening. In davening is already a korban. In davening is already a reichkeit. Moreover, even in the achana before tefillah, and the bittul associated with the achana kedemat tefillah, it depends how the bittul comes about. If before davening I'm thinking I'm nothing because I haven't fulfilled my mission, I'm not nothing. Alternatively, the middle letter, says bonus. Alternatively, if before davening I am thinking I am nothing because I have no shaykhs to anything, ich bin garnish, that's the bittul of this maamar. So in other words, if you distill it, if you cook this maamar down, you can summarize this maamar in one word: iskafia. Not a mevel de ishapcha, iskafia. What's iskafia? Sacrifice to the Eibishter. What do I get for it? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. There's no return. Why am I doing it? To me, if I understand this correctly, this is the heart of this maamar. But if this were the heart of this maamar wouldn't be 15 pages, it would be 6 pages. But there's a lot more to the maamar. Because the Rebbe, so to speak, makes a concession. I want to be careful how I use words, because this is Teda. But looking at it from the perspective of Das Tacht, and the concession the Rebbe makes is like this: Hezachai. You really want to bring a korban? You really want to do an avodah l'mayla mitam das legani? You really want to do a skafia she'eina mevel de'ez ha'apcha? There's only one way: sacrifice yourself. Why? Because in a korban there's a richness, there's a return. In the korban aveda ruchnis b'nefesh adam, in your davening there's a return. Says Rebbe, okay, but still. In other words, even though the amitis hakorban is when I'm sacrificing myself and getting nothing back, which is much more in the keved reisha kedamat tefillah than the tefillah itself. But when a yid davens, or a yid brings a korban, where it's taka emes that he is getting something back. It's not like the bittul we talked about tonight. I'm sacrificing myself for no return. But I'm bringing a korban, I'm being nichol in a lakus, which is a gewaldige reichkeit. It's still a korban. It's still a korban because it's not about bringing the Eibishter into me. It's not about tailoring the Eibishter to my size. It's raising myself up in the lashon of this maamar to lakus she'einei berach ha'elamus. I'm including myself in a godliness which is not one step higher than me, but so many steps higher than me that when I bring this korban, I become completely lost. In other words, the most perfect concept of a korban is when I get nothing, I only sacrifice. But even if it's not a perfect of a concept of a korban, it's a korban, I'm getting something back. What am I getting back? Hiskalas nelakus. Because it's a tnu of halah, because a korban means I'm raising myself up, because it's a tnu of halah, the lashon is yitzia mimti yusei. It's also in the infinite skaf. And this I'm going to leave for the next year. Okay, what I did tonight, in terms of pages, I did very little. I did the first few prakam I overviewed Bekitzer. I did Sivvov, in other words, the bottom of Chafei and Chavav, and then I did a little bit Lamed Aleph, and Lamed Beis. The rest of the maamar is a korban, which is halah, but not, there's no return. A halah will become included in Getlichkeit. We'll do this in Mitzvah Shem on Tuesday. Okay, this is the sheet. Okay, the first is, we agreed that the key to this maamar is Perek Vov, where the Rebbe explains the difference between the Perek Aleph of the Fidikas Basi Legani and the Perek Beis. What's the difference? Perek Aleph is Hapcha, Perek Aleph is Va'asu Li Mikdash, Techol Echad V'Echad Misol, making the world a Kelin Talakus, bringing godliness down. It's Hapcha doesn't mean you become Ois Metzias Faked. It's Hapcha means you remain in Metzias, your Metzias is godliness. Perek Beis is a Skafia, right? And as I showed you, the Ha'ara, including also and perhaps especially Iskafia she'eina mevel deis hapcha bittul ascent, raising yourself up. Now in the previous shiur I climbed into a crack. I, so to speak, focused on what I believe in the Mugadik version of the Basi Legani is the Iker Chiddush.
And incidentally, if you look in the Bilti Muggah, you b'chalal don't see this. Klal. The Maamar Bilti Muggah is a geschmacke, easy, straight Maamar, because all this stuff about the skafia and bittul is not there at all, just karbonos. And the last year, I get parkets that there is bittul where there's no return, just becoming ois mitzias. And this is more in davening than in karbonos. That was the big chiddush of the Maamar. That aveda karbonos beruchnis benefesh ha'adam is more of a carbon than an actual carbon, because a carbon is this hapcha, and this is bittul. And I connected it to later on in this Maamar the keved dereish kedem atfila, particularly the keved dereish of the Mittel Rebbe, which is a keved dereish that's not I'm nothing because I didn't do my shlichus, I'm nothing because I have a lone neshama, bittul. Or in the language you can have later in the Maamar, carbon lashon rikaven, radik, bittul. So we did the complicated stuff. We did the controversial stuff. Tonight we'll do stam. In other words, the Maamar glat. In other words, the hard part I did already. The part that you could say I made up and is wrong, we did. Tonight is glat. And let's start from the beginning. What's the difference between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis? Perek Aleph means making the world a Beis HaMikdash. Bringing godliness down, transforming the world, transforming oneself. Making them a keli for the kus. Fine. What's Perek Beis? Not bringing godliness down, but raising yourself up into godliness. That's all. What's the difference between Perek Aleph and Perek Beis? Raising yourself up. The deepest concept of raising yourself up, tak, is bittul. But beklolos, as a rule, karbanas are also included in this idea of raising yourself up. So although, according to this Mugadika Maamar, no iskafia, no raising oneself up is as perfect as the bittul without any giluyim, but karbanas beklolos nifan Allah. So look on page Chaf Vav, the second paragraph, and let's read it. Even though I said to you at the end of the previous paragraph that real bittul is in tefillah, is an I'm nothing, the emes is you could say that iskafia is true by karbonis also. Let's first preface. What is the ma'ila shebeiskafia al hapri? What makes iskafia greater than ishapra? Of course, we always think of iskafia as a stepping stone to ishapra. Here we're saying iskafia is higher than ishapra, and what is that? The inyan ishapra, who the idea of ishapra is sha'adovar nishar b'mitziyusei. When you transform something into godliness, you're not destroying the things. To the contrary, it remains a mitziyus. Ela shemitziyusi mitziyus the kedusha, but its form is transformed into holiness. So iskafia doesn't mean you destroy anything. It simply means you're transforming it. The iskafio inyan abitl. Well, iskafia is the bittul. What makes it bittul? Simply the fact that it's yitziyah mimitziyusei, going out of your form, out of your identity. This is iskafia. Says the Rebbe, this is the reason. For the idea that the ultimate giving back from the Rebishter, when a Yid does iskafia, and he's bittling himself to the Rebishter, ultimately he's going to get more. He nihilis yesa is going to be even higher. When you work on yourself with the kavanah to make yourself a keli and telekus, you only mamshich from one madrega. When you work on yourself to make yourself a carbon velokus, since your kavanah is to give yourself away to the Eibishter completely, the gili which you're going to get subsequently is going to be higher. It's like when a person undertakes to go out of his mitzvahs altogether, to become ayin. So because your intention and your endeavors to give yourself away to the Eibishter altogether, you arouse and bring down bechinas ayin, amiti, the true ayin, shalamaylim mitzvahs, which is completely beyond mitzvahs. So in his hapcha, I'm making myself a keli for alakus. What kind of alakus do you get? The alakus you made yourself a keli for. In the skafi, you're making yourself a carbon telekus, so alakus, your mamshech is what he calls ayin amiti. Therefore, says the Rebbe, let's broaden the issue. That although we said in the previous shtickle, the true iskafia is only bittul, nevertheless, we could say, Ashayches Davedis HaKarbonis, Gam de Karbonis Kimshutam, not just the bittul in the nefesh other, but also the actual sacrifice of a carbon, that in the previous paragraph, the Rebbe said himself, sacrificing a carbon is hapcha, not the iskafia. The Rebbe says, nope,
in a certain way, sacrificing a korban is also an inyan for neskafia. Leiskafia. Inyan akarban is who? What's the concept of a korban? Allah, milmata lamaila, raising yourself up from a lower level to a lower level. The inyan Allah milmata lamaila who? When one raises himself up from a lower level to a higher level, mizbatal mimitzi Yosef v'nechel v'ha'elyin, Yumitzias becomes but included in the higher one. And therefore you could say even about karbanes, that although karbanes is about experiencing godliness on a higher level, it's even a skafi and bittel. And they're skipping the brackets. V'inyan zeh hu teichen inyan de skafi. Now Rabbi say, ich will euch erklären. You must understand that the Rebbe is climbing into a particular space, and you got to stay in that space. Okay? And the space that we're climbing into is that you want to be oile to a lakus shalamayla mishedish and ibrahim. The significance of the ha'alah of a korban, which makes it a skafia like, which makes it kalois hanefesh like, what makes it korban like, is that you're raising yourself up to a lakus shalamayla mishedish mitziyuse. I mean, you have different expressions, or on top of page chavches shalamayla mishaychos leilis. I'll give them to verstehen. Let's first speak in the most extreme circumstances. Most extreme circumstances, we have something called atzmus, and something called giluyim. Right? What's atzmus? The Eibishter. What's giluyim? Godliness. And godliness has levels. What do we know about the Eibishter? We know about the Eibishter is the Eibishter you cannot feel. With the Eibishter you can have no relationship. With the Eibishter there's no fun. There's no excitement. There's no dynamism. There's no geschmack. There is only bittul. Finished. Sacrifice. There's no me. To use the language of Ha'ara 78, the Rebbe says that the Alter Rebbe used to say, Vim chalei chafafti. Ich will man nicht das dich allein. So the Rebbe brings in Ha'ara 78 that this expression of the Alter Rebbe, I want only you, can be understood in two ways. The way the Tzemach Tzedek explains it, and the way the Tzemach explains it, is dich allein, I want the Eibishter. And the Rebbe says that when the Alter Rebbe said, Ich will man nicht das dich allein, and he meant the Eibishter, that's korban, that's sacrifice. I'm going to get nothing back. When it comes to the Eibishter, all you do is sacrifice yourself. Our Maamar brings a lower Vim chalei chafafti, ukefi sheyizbaya lekama, and I'm going to go back to it later. Okay, so the first thing is the Eibishter. When it comes to the Eibishter himself, we have our last shiur, bittul, no reciprocity, no oil, no gili, no geschmack, just bittul, finished. Okay, now, but then you have giluyim, getlachkeit. When you talk about getlachkeit, you have, of course, a lot of madregas. The lowest madregas of getlachkeit, for lack of word, is called malaklam. Oil belongs to a keli, it fits into a keli, it goes into a keli. What happens? The keli is raised up a little, the oil is brought down a little. It's a good fit. It's a good fit. But if it's a good fit, you're never going to say the keli is becoming bottled. Okay, the keli is becoming enriched. Becoming rich. What were to happen if you were somehow to put into a keli an oil of Sevav Kalam? Kalim and Sevav Kalam are not such good friends. Why? Because a keli is a davar b'medidavat bola. A keli is a davar from his chalkus, from pratim. Sevav Kalaman doesn't have didavat bola. The Riki of Sevav Kalaman is igulim. It's an akudah. There's no pratim. When Sevav Kalaman reach a keli, the keli could break like an el mateu. The keli could become completely bottled, ois. But you're never going to say that you have real harmony between the oid and the keli. Because the oid is too strong, the oid is too plain, the oid is too indivisible, and the keli is too limited and divided for this to be a good batch. Yeah. Now think about oids which are even higher than Sevav Kalaman. When you bring into a keli or oid which is higher to Sevav Kalaman, or higher to Sevav Kalaman, you pay a bittul. However, there's a very big difference between saying that when I bring in an oid of Sevav Kalaman, or which is Sevav Kalaman, Lamayla for Sevav Kalaman, I pay a bittul, than saying that when somebody relates to Atzmos as a bittul. Why? Because when you're related to a Atzmus, you're never going to feel the Eibishter. The Eibishter doesn't feel like anything. He's beyond any heritage. So when a person has a bittul to the Eibishter, you're becoming Ois Metzias, and you're becoming Ois Metzias without any kind of hiskalus, without any kind of being nichla. What are you included in? You're not included in anything. You're just Ois. When you experience an Insaf, if you experience Mamalik Kalam and Malkam Chalal Bittul, experience Save of Kalam, it's a shtickle bittul, yeah, it's a shtickle bittul. The Oid is higher than the Keli is raised up into it. When you're experiencing a Lakus, which is even higher than Save of Kalam, and there's Taka Gvaldik a bittul. But what kind of a bittul? The kind of a bittul where the Keli is becoming the Oid. It's raised up to the Madreg of the Oid. So now, let's say I have to think about it. If a Korban brought down a light of Mamalik Kalam, if a Korban brought down a light of Mamalik Kalam, if a Korban brought down a light of Mamalik Kalam, you would have to call Korbanos Ishapcha. You would have to call Korbanos Dida B'Tachtayim. Like the Rebbe said in last year. Why? What's Dida B'Tachtayim? What's V'asol L'Midrash Shechanti B'Seicham? What's Ishapcha? You take a physical thing, you make it a keli for the Eibishter. The Eibishter rests in it and doesn't destroy it. If a Korban was Mamshech Mamalik Kalam, you could no way call a Korban Eskafia. You couldn't call in no way a Korban Aliyah. You could call a Korban in no way Bittul. It's not Bittul, it's transformation. I am now a Keli for the Kus. Says the Rebbe, a Korban is not an Aliyah in Mamalik Kalam. A Korban is Aliyah in Save of Kalam. A Korban is Aliyah in Elakus higher than Save of Kalam. Okay? For example, L'mayla Mishedish HaYishtalshalos. L'mayla Mishedish HaNivroyim. Okay? Or, in the same Ha'ara 78 that I mentioned to you a minute before, Ve'im chaloicha fatzti, ich will me nish as dich allein. Not the Tzemach Tzedek, ich will me nish as dich allein. The Rebbe Marash, ich will me nish as dich allein. To the highest Madregas of Ein Sof. When somebody says, I want the highest Madregas of Ein Sof, as opposed to saying, I want the Eibishter. When someone says, I want the Eibishter, having the Eibishter is bittul. When someone says, I want the highest Madregas of Ein Sof, it's also bittul. But now it's nichlal. Your Metzias is bottled in the Elakus. There's no such thing as being bottled in the Eibishter. There is only such a thing as being bottled to the Eibishter. So in the previous Shiur, we spoke about bittul to the Eibishter. In this Shiur, we're talking about bittul in the Eibishter. And of course, it doesn't mean the Eibishter, it means Ein Sof. So the Rebbe says, if you're going to be a purist, if you're going to be an action, and you're going to say that the only thing you could call Iskafia, the only thing you could call Ha'lah, the only thing you can call bittul, is to the Eibishter himself, the Imchalei Chafasya, the Tzemach Tzedek, then Korbanos are not Iskafia, Korbanos already is Hapach. Like I told you on Sunday night. But the Rebbe says, let's cut some slack for Korbanos. Let us put Korbanos into the Iskafia camp. Chachafilu, Korbanos is a Gilead. It's a light. How are you going to put Korbanos into the Iskafia camp? You're going to say a Pashtas. When a person is Makiv and Korban becomes bottle, and he's Nichol in a Lakus. He's bottle and Nichol in a Lakus. What does that mean? You are included in godliness. But not the kind of godliness you're a Keli for, but the kind of godliness which is going to obliterate your Metzias. But the nature of this obliteration is not I am Ois. The nature of this obliteration is that I am Oir. I am the Oir in which I was Nichol. So to compare it to the bittul of the last Shiur, to the Imcha Lecha Fasi the Tzemach Tzedek, we cannot. But at least we'll be able to say that Korbanos is not as Hapcha. Because Hapcha means bringing godliness into a vessel in this world. When you're Makav a Korban, since in a Korban you're going to be bottled to save of Kalalman, to hide and save of Kalalman, and when you have a bittul of a Keli, to save of Kalalman, hide, save of Kalalman, it becomes Eis Metzias. And that's the new dimensions. This Shiur versus last Shiur. In the last Shiur, it means bittul is only to the Eibishter. Like I said, look in Order 78. The Imcha Leicha Fasti the Tzemach Tzedek. In this Shiur, we're going to say Hezachayim. Bittul to Ein Sof is also a Korban. Is also a Skafia. The Imcha Leicha Fasti of the Rebbe Marash. That when your bottles are the highest Madregas of Ein Sof, we taka say you're Nichlal. You're being raised up. It's not suddenly becoming Ois Metzias. but you're being raised up to such a high madrega of Ein Sof that it is after all bittul and not tamshil. This is the nekuda of the Maamar that we're going to be learning today. Go ahead.
Isn't that like a ratzei?
Yeah, but there's madregas of ratzei. There's a ratzei to a eir which is close to you. There's a ratzei to eir which is far away from you. There's a ratzei which is even further away from you.
That means that afterwards there's also a shuv.
No, that's the word. In a korban there's no shuv. If the ratzei was to a close eir, after the ratzei would be a shuv. Since the ratzei is such a high eir, that's the way it stays. Which is the explanation for why a korban goes into the iskafia camp. It goes into the bittul camp. Chachafilu, it's only gilui. When you bring a korban, there's going to be a return, a hamshacha. But that's not your doing. That's a matana from the Meibishter. You're doing a sacrifice. So, understand the space where this Maamar is taking place in. This Maamar is not talking about bittul to the Meibishter. But this Maamar is also not talking about being a keli for alakus, which means bittul to mamalak lama. This Maamar is talking about bittul to a very high level of light. Because it's light, you're being raised up into it. But because it's a high level, you're being raised up into it as a bittul of your metzias. And therefore, karbonis kipshutam, although there's an element of giluyim, an element of ishapcha in them, go into the category of bittul. And the whole Maamar is poshet examples for this. In Sif Zayin you have 3 examples. In Sif Ches you have 1 more example. I suppose you could say that in Sif Tes and Sif Yud you have noch an example, and then in Yud Aleph you have weiter an example. Poshet examples for what it means when a Yid brings a korban, his mitzias is being nichel and alakus, but a very high madreg of alakus, which is poiling like a leisa nefesh in the middle of his mitzias. This is an yifan akor. Go ahead.
How come bittul to save common? How come I don't understand why is that not making yourself a keli kalabus?
Because you can't be mamshach save common.
But after that, there's a shuv.
No.
Then how keli exists?
In the context of a korban, they're ois. They're taking nichel and save common.
Save common is ukol alam mashava. So every keli should be bittul to save common.
Through this avoid it is. Because there are other avoiders. And the other avoiders is about making kelim, not being mevatel kelim. And they're mamshach alakos. There's different avoiders. The avoider of karbonis, although karbonis kipshutam is giloyim and not atzmos, it's such high giloyim that's in front of it. Your question is the pshat in the Maamar. It's not a question, it's the pshat in the Maamar. There's different avoiders. So let's start Sif Zayin. And Sif Zayin is most interesting. It's so interesting. It sounds like a sicha with an Maamar, because this is a Rebbe's original. You're not going to find this in the Maamar from the Friedrich Rabbeim. You just won't find it. All of us know that the kavanah is the Agas. Yeah, correct? So one of the kashas which is often asked in Hasidus is, if the purpose of creation is this world, why bother with Ishtalshalos? Why go through all the steps, an Atzilus, and a Bria, and a Yetzira, and an Asiya, and so forth and so on? Just go from Atzmus to Elamazim. Why?
So we can reach Hashem.
So the Rebbe answers, if there was just Atzmus and us, we would have no concept of raising ourselves up. Because to the Eibishter, you cannot relate. In other words, the Eibishter you cannot feel. You can believe in and you can bittul yourself, but you can't experience it. So there's just the Eibishter and just us. How do we come closer to the Eibishter with a feeling? So the Eibishter made higher worlds, and then he created this world. Since we can relate to the light in the higher worlds, we can climb gradually, slowly, until we reach a state of betelim lukus. In other words, when you live in Asiya, and you're relating to the oil for the sake of argument of Yitzira, that's not a carbon. That's not a carbon. That's faket, that's Ratziv V'Shoiv, that's Eidus and Kelim. When you're in Asiya, and you're relating, say, for example, to the Kelim and stuff of Bria, it's a little bit bigger stretch. But when you're in Asiya, and you're relating to Ein Sof, which is an Atzilus and higher than Atzilus, At this point, since you are so low, and you're related to a light which is so high, your attempt at connecting to this madrega of Ein Sof is going to affect in you, not that you're bringing the godliness down, but you're going to become bottled, which is the carbon in Giluyah. So the Eibishter created a bunch of worlds to allow us to first to relate to worlds closer to us, which is going to affect, we're making ourselves like Keli and Yitzhak. But through them we're going to relate to a higher world and a higher world until the kind of world which is going to pale in us a bit. So the Eibishter created Seder Ishtalshus, didn't only create Asiyah for the sake of Karbonis. What's a carbon that you're relating to such a high level of light that it pales in you a bit? That's point one. Point two. What is the meaning of the statement, Yerida Zu Tzerech Aliyah? What is the meaning of the statement, Yerida Zu Tzerech Aliyah? The neshama goes down in order to go up. What does that sound like? Now before the neshama went down, it was up. Before the world went down, it was up. Let me ask you a question. The Eibishter created everything, yeah? So why did he create stuff up there and then have what's called a Yerida, create them down here in the first place? If the Eibishter creates only a Gashmi Zdeka world, if our neshamas never were in Atzilus, just the Atzmos created our neshamas in this world, you wouldn't say Yerida. You would say Tachten, perhaps. Why Yerida? Why did our neshamas, why did this world have to be included in the higher world and then have a Yerida and then a Yerida? Why? The answer is the same. If we started out down here in utter darkness, there'd be no frame of reference by which we could relate to the Eibishter. Because you cannot relate to Atzmos. You can't feel the Eibishter. You can only relate to and feel Madregas Nerin Sof. So the Eibishter made this world in the higher worlds. And then brought it out of the higher worlds down. So the higher worlds become our source. So now I'm relating to my source. But the kind of source with which I can relate, and because it's the kind of source with which I can relate, I relate to that source. So on the lowest levels, I bring that source into my kelim, and that's not bittul at all. But when I relate to a higher and higher source, eventually I'm relating to a source of Seif of Kalaman, and a source which is even higher than Seif of Kalaman, and I'm becoming bottle in that source. And my becoming bottle in that source is, I am becoming one with a very high madrega of Ein Sof. There's so many different names. What's called Shalamayla Mishachas La'ilamis. And when I am relating to She'ein Shachas La'ilamis, Shalamayla Mishachas La'ilamis, the bittul that I experience in that oir, it does mean I'm transformed into the oir, but the bittul means become Ois Metzias, and therefore a carbon also infinite Skafi. So the first argument was that the Eibishter made a Hishtalshalus. The second argument was not only make a Hishtalshalus, he made that the lower world should have once been in the higher worlds. There's something to return to. And then he brings the third point, all in Siv Zion. Everybody knows something called Ein Sof. And that the Ein Sof that the Eibishter invested in the lower world is called Kav. And we also know that the Kav was once included in what he called the Maamar in Ein Sof Shalifnei HaTzimtzum. And when the Kav was included in Ein Sof Shalifnei HaTzimtzum, it wasn't Shaychas. It was Bottle Ein Shaychas, Ein Klinika. If you had Tzimtzum Arishin, and a Bekiyam, Tagan Tzanamaisis, till a Kav form. In fact, I can ask you a question. What's the point? First, you have the Kav as part of the Ein Sof. Then you have to make a Silik Legami. Then you have to have a Hakor. Then you have to have a Bekiya. And then the Kav of the Tzimtzum. Make the Kav of Chatchila after the Tzimtzum. What's the tenet? If the Eibishter would make the Kav of Chatchila after the Tzimtzum, the Kav would have no relation to the Tzimtzum. And if the Kav had no relation to the Tzimtzum, there would be no such concept as growing up, going back. The Eibishter made the Kav in Atzmos, in Moed, in Lifnei Tzimtzum. Then he made a Tzimtzum Arishin and a Hefsek and a Bekiya and all the good Zach. And the Kav is able to relate to its source because it came from its source. And when the Kav is relating to a very high madrega of its source, the effect of the oir on the Kav is one of his batlos, it's one of aliyah, eskafia, carbon, not one of his hapcha, transformation, and bringing out limits down.
Why would the Kav not be connected to?
If Atzmos created a Kav, to the Ein Sof, the Tzimtzum has no shaychus. It didn't come from it. To the Eibishter, it's not shaychus to have a shaychus. The Eibishter is not a Metzias Nimtz. So this Kav would only know the Dvekas of a Malak Alam, the Alakus of this lower Madrega. It would never know a higher Madrega in Alakus. Allah has come of a Kama, Madrega in Alakus, which is Lamaila Meshachas Leilis.
So those are three svaras. One, why the Eibishter made a hishtalshlus. Two, why this world is called Yeridet Zerech Aliyah. Three, why Ein Sof had to be once be included in Lifnei Tzimtzum. That all prove that there's a concept of us raising ourselves up. But raising ourselves up in the kind of a way which is called bittul. Because I'm related to Elokus, which is L'mayla M'Sheish Mitziyusei, and therefore it's even a skaf, it's even a makar. And the Perek Ches continues. And he brings another example from Lekut HaTeirah, not from the Rebbe. What is in Lekut HaTeirah? That it says in Chazal Nachas Ruach Lafon Naishamar even as the Tzeni the Eibush gets Nachas Ruach. And by the way, for those who haven't learned the Maamrim, the word Nachas means to rest. Shuv, to bring down. The Choyz Darga Mesivitz Nachas means to bring down. Karbonas give the Eibush to Amoyed in the Nachas Ruach. So the Rebbe asks the obvious question: Vosep is Karbonas? All Mesivitz Nachas Ruach. And the Rebbe answers the question. The Rebbe Dalta Rebbe does by bringing a Maimeh Chazal. Before the Eibush created the world, Hashem had a name. And all that existed was Hashem and His name. Finished. What's the name of Hashem? The name of Hashem is Malchus of Atzilus, Hashem's kingship. Or in other words, the name of Hashem is the source from which the Eibush created all of the worlds. So it says the Pirkei Rebbe Lezer, before the Eibush created the world, Hashem and His name were alone. No? The Eibush made worlds. What happened? The Eibush made worlds. His name came out of Him. His name came forward from Him. And His name spoke into existence all the variety of creations. Right? Malchus of Atzilus creates elements. Before the Eibush created the world, there was a Malchus of Atzilus which was Batil. Now that the Eibush created a world, the worlds are made into a Metzias because of the Keach of Malchus of Atzilus. Okay? Why did the Eibush do this? Why did the Eibush have to have Malchus and Lifnei Tzimtzum? And then make a Tzimtzum Marish and bring Malchus forward to create worlds. And to have a bittul where the Eibush made his world. They should have made Malchus. Before the Eibush created the world, there should be no Malchus. Tell us the same thing. What was gained by Malchus existing? Lifnei Tzimtzum, that when we're created, we know we're connected. Not just to the godliness, which is close to us, we're connected to the highest madrigas of God, Lifnei Tzimtzum. We could raise ourselves to those levels, and we're raising ourselves to those highest levels of godliness. We're becoming Batal B'Mitzias, which is an Avodah Sakala. This Perek Ches, which adds the fourth point, is in the Malkut Rebbe's Maamar. And the Rebbe goes on to say at the end of Perek Ches that it's not just true of people, it's not just true of Karbanis, it's true also of Malachim. Because when we bring a carbon, part of the carbon that we're feeding the Ishin, Malachim called Ishin, the Malachim also have an Aliyah. Okay, and it brings the idea of Kol Baal Shir, Yetzim B'Shir, V'Nichnasim B'Shir. There brings now order 45 that Malachim are called Baal Shir, the Shamash are not called Baal Shir, but they're also involved in Shir. There's the song, the music effect that a Yid and a Shamash should be Oile, but not Oile in a measurable way, not only Oile to a close source, Oile in an immeasurable way, Oile to a far source. This is Perek Ches. So you have essentially 4 examples for this idea. What's a carbon? Not necessarily bittul to Atzmos. It could even be a bittul to Ein Sof, but the highest madrigas. Because when I'm bottled to the highest madrigas of Ein Sof, that's called Hiskalus, that's called Kaleis HaNefesh, and if it's a carbon, if it's a halal, if it's a Ratzi B'Lishu. What are the examples? Why Hashem created a Hishtashlis? Why we call this world Yeridet Zerech Aliyah? Why Hashem created the Kav called Lifnei Tzimtzum? And why before the Eibush created the world did He have a name? And in Sif Ches, the Rebbe continues talking about Karbonos. Okay, and let's learn Sif Ches inside. I'm sorry, Sif Tes. Inside. So the Rebbe Lahoy, Sif, let's add. The Zeh Karbonos, Winyan Allah, we are trying to separate Karbonos from all other avodas, and saying other avodas is a rotzei and a shuv. Maybe I'm running to the Eibishter, but I'm bringing the Eibishter down, and in a carbon I'm sacrificing myself to the Eibishter. Chachafilu, this is a sacrifice to Ein Sof, and not to Atzmos. We have to explain what's special about karbonis. Says Rebbe Muvah Gamizeh Shenikraim B'Shem Carbon. This can be argued simply from the name. They're called karbonis. The special Hashem is teaching about names. Skip the parenthesis. The Shmei shall call Dava Shikei B'Losh Nakedesh. Turn the page, the name of everything. Page Lamed now. Meir Alachayet Alakisha shows on His godliness.
So the Baal Shem Tov teaches the power of a name. Let's analyze the word in the name, Korban. So the Rebbe says, top of page Lamed, the Korban hu miloshen kiruv, the word Korban means coming close. Shemiskar, Elokus, you're approaching God, and it's not boys, slow down. When you approach godliness as a Malak Alama, it's also approaching godliness. But when you're approaching God as a Malak Alama, you're not losing yourself. To the contrary, you're becoming richer. When you approach godliness as Sevav Kalam, Alachas Kama Vakama, if you're approaching godliness, which is higher than Sevav Kalam, you're also experiencing godliness. But in the experience of godliness, of Sevav and higher than Sevav, you're becoming bottle. That is what is unique about Kabbalah. Sure, every mitzvah you're approaching the Eibush. But in every mitzvah you're approaching godliness on a level of Malak Kalam, you're going to bring the godliness back. Shuv, it's hapche. Dire betachtoinim, betech Yisrael. In a korban, you're approaching the infinity of godliness, which is going to affect in you his battles inside. Okay, when you bring godliness down, the way you come close to godliness, you become godliness comes close to you from above, as opposed to the korban lashon kira. Why is the meaning of the word korban? A sacrifice to the Meibish in parenthesis, Shumaskar of Elokus, you're approaching godliness. Who this means? Shuhu Yaitse you say you forfeit your identity. V'nichal b'Elokus, you become included in Elokus. Now, you can hardly say Yaitse Mim Yusei v'nichal Elokus when you Yaitse Mim Yusei for the aid of Malak Alaman. Aid of Malak Alaman fits into your mitzvah. So when Yaitse Mim Yusei, when you're relating to higher madregas of Ein Sof, where you could call them Bittel and Eskalos, Bittel and Eskafia, although there's a Giloyim influence. This is further confirmed by what Alter Rebbe says. The lahar kriv hu eisius lahar kriv, that a korban is the of rotting, recovered or bittel betachlis. But in a korban, it's not like the bittel ta'atzum we talked about in the last year. It's a bittel te'erin sof. But the Rebbe says, let me explain to you what I mean. Shalom, the korban is when a person brings a korban, he is raising himself, but not raising himself one notch or two notches. In which case, he would be a keli for the Ein Sof. But he's relating to God, which is infinitely high. Which goes to be it's high and the Isa bezeh that hechen salak ru'us the korban v'chol the will of Kabbalah reaches till where le'ela ad Ein Sof. Says the Rebbe v'lachein, and this is why a bittul dekavos, a bittul dekavos, bittul betachas. If I'm relating to God, which is close to me, I feel if you're going to say there's a bittul, says yen a bittul. Since karbonis is different than all mitzvahs, that I'm relating to an Ein Sof, to a God which is beyond my mitzvahs, therefore there's an inyan of bittul. Okay? So, a karbon b'gashmias has an Ein Sof, as opposed to a karbon ruchnis which has only the Eibishter. And a karbon b'gashmias has a certain desire to be one with godliness, which is not true in a karbon of a person where you sacrifice enough to the Eibishter. But at least a karbon where a person is approaching the Eibishter, since he's trying to relate to a very high madrega of Ein Sof, it affected him made in the Kabbalah. Now that the Rebbe gave us these 4 or 5 examples, the Rebbe says, let's talk about davening. Now, Chevre, you know from the last year that when we talk about davening, we talked about Keved Reish. We talked about davening. We talked about the idea of becoming totally bottled to the Eibishter without any return. Now the Rebbe is changing his mind. In other words, the Rebbe is becoming more generous. He's broadening the definition of korban. Korban doesn't only mean bittul to atzmos. Korban could also mean a bittul to a high madrega of Ein Sof. If it's a high madrega in oil, I'm feeling it. Sure, you're feeling it, but the effect of feeling it is kaleis hanefesh. That's why it's a korban. Adam ki yakrav mikam, a person sacrifices himself. The yiri, the neshama lamato tzerech al neshama comes down in order to go up. Shehi yin Allah malmat Allah mal the neshama should ascend from a low level to a higher level. Lotzeis mimics used to go out of its formerly cultivating stuff. Says the Rebbe v'aliyah shalai betfil. The time that this occurs is during davening. The tefillah is connected on tiknum. Ugetein is the Baal Shem Tov, which I read to you in the last shir. The Baal Shem Tov says a vod dezesh ha'adam chayach arat tefillah. When a person finishes davening and is still alive, ein ze al pitev etzanes. Why?
Not because you're bottled to atzmos, like I told you in the last year, but because you're bottled to Ein Sof. But to a very high madrega of Ein Sof, and when you're bottled to a high madrega of Ein Sof, although you're experiencing the Ein Sof as opposed to atzmos, but this experience of Ein Sof is peeling his batlos in you. So now, we talked about a carbon begashmis, and said when a person makes a carbon begashmis, you could also call it a skafi. You could also call it halal. You could also call it bittul, because it's being bottled in itself, which is lamayla m'sherish mitzvah yosef. And the same is true in a person. What is the carbon in a person? A carbon in a person is a person's desire for the highest madrigas of itself. When a person desires the Eibush himself, there's no experience of riches whatsoever. That's pure bittul. I've spoken in the previous year. When a person desires the riches of itself, he's having some of an experience of godliness. But the effect of this experience is one of complete battles. And he brings the Maamar Chazal name, before davening you have to have bittul. Correct? And he explains this is last year. Two efanim in bittul before davening. One efan in bittul is I'm nothing. That's all, I'm nothing. In I'm nothing there is no something. Finished, I'm garnished. The second efan of bittul is the Tzemach Tzedek's, which is on page Lamed Beis. What's the Tzemach Tzedek's bittul is I'm nothing because I haven't finished my mission. The moment you associate your nothingness with your mission, you're something. So even the Achna of Shifos, the bittul of the Tzemach Tzedek is ready for Gilui. Why? Because the fact that you're bottled to a kavana makes it a tashtikul metzius. So the Rebbe says it's true. Not only like we discussed on Sunday, that a person has to be bottled to the Eibishter with no sense of reciprocity, only then is it a carbon. Now we're saying Giluyim is also a carbon, as long as it's higher madrigas of Giluyim. And when a person before davening thinks I'm nothing, that's a bittul to the Eibishter. And when a person before davening thinks I haven't fulfilled my mission, that's a bittul, not to the Eibishter, but to higher madrigas of Giluyim. And at the end of Sif Yud, the Rebbe brings the famous Alter Rebbe. I mean, there's very few halachas in Shulchan Aruch which the Rebbe quoted more times. So the Rebbe always wanted to talk about thinking Chassidus. Before davening, he quoted the Ramah. The Ramah said, before you daven, you have to think about the lowliness of man and the loftiness of God. No? The lowliness of man and the loftiness of God is bittul or is kalalus? What do you say, Mendy? Becoming included in a higher level of godliness. Bittul on nothing or bittul of kalei nefesh. The lowliness of man and the greatness of God. The Rebbe says it's kalos. If I only was thinking of the lowliest of man, you'd be right. But because the chiyuv is shiflas adam and the reima musakel, you're not thinking reimus of atzmus. Atzmus you don't understand. You have no sense of his reimus. You think of the reimus of alakus, which means that when the tzad and shochan narach before davening, the thing chasidus on the madreg of Giluyim. Not I'm nothing. I am nothing in my relationship with the Eibishter. It's about 10 lines from the end of Sif Yud on page Lam Beis. Before a person's davening. A person must contemplate the greatness of the Eibishter and the lowliness of man. When a person thinks about his own loneliness, it's not a thing unto itself. When you think I'm low, you're nothing. When you think I'm low and God is great, you're becoming great because God is great. I'm low and God is great, I'm not so low. That's a korban. It's not like when I'm sacrificing myself, I'm low and I'm nothing. There's the head of the greatness of the Eibishter. And because the head of the greatness of the Eibishter, I want to be nichal the Eibishter even kalei nefesh. So it's taka korban. But there's a dead head, there's a sense of feeling bittul to the Eibishter. And the Rebbe goes on in the next peirik to bring a maimer from the Rebbe Marash. And in this maimer from the Rebbe Marash, if I'm not wrong, the discussion is about the concept of kalei nefesh. First of all, technically, when a person does a hisbananos in order to reach kalei nefesh, what's the hisbananos going to be? Says the Rebbe, it's not going to be a hisbananos in Bria. It's not going to be a hisbananos in Atzilus. It's going to be a hisbananos in Eretz. Or as the Rebbe says in the Maamar, you're going to be mizbein and antochad alei b'cheshbon. In the madrega of godliness, which is not only higher than cheshbon, has no shaychus to cheshbon whatsoever. Kalei nefesh means not I'm becoming ois metzias. Kalei means I'm being included in godliness. If you want to be included in godliness, you cannot think of of godliness which is up the street. It's limited. The God that's up the street is not going to make a nefesh, it can lead to a bigger nefesh. In order to experience godliness through kalaisa nefesh, you have to relate to very, very lofty levels of light. So he calls it Antu Chad V'lei B'chushbon. Antu Chad V'lei B'chushbon is not the Eibishter. Antu Chad V'lei B'chushbon is Eibishter Linis, Getlachkeit, which is, to use a classic form, the Mocker of Seva V'Klamet, the Potz of the Mocker of Malaklamet. Antu Chad, it's one. There's many spheres, but you only see one. V'lei B'chushbon, it's Get Nishan the Cheshbon from the spheres. In other words, it's not higher than the spheres. It has nothing to do with the spheres. If something was higher than the number 10, so it has a shaykhs to the 10. Has no connection to the numbers whatsoever, it's a bein areich. So the Rebbe says, the idea of a carbon is to affect in yourself a kaleis, a nefesh, and a bittel, by relating to that madreg in a lakus, which is the madreg of antuchad, in other words, not godliness which is close to me, which I'm a keli for, but relating to God that's very far away from, which repels the meaning of like a bittel. And then he brings the word from the Marash. And the Marash connects us to V'im Chalei Chafast. Now this is very controversial. And this is the heart of 78, which I referenced before. Everybody knows V'im Chalei Chafast. How do we know V'im Chalei Chafast? Do you know? How do we know this stated from the Alter Rebbe? The Alter Rebbe used to say all the time, How do the Alter Rebbe said it many times? How do we know this statement? God is mili b'shamayim V'im Chalei Chafast ba'aretz. Ich will that God is, ich will dein Gan Eden, ich will dein Mabach, ich will meines das dich allein. Which date? The last day of the year. Chai Kislev. Erev Rosh Hashanah v'Chazidus is this one. So it's conspicuous. I'm not misspelled from Gan Eden, I'm not misspelled from El Mabach, I want you. You is Atzmus. You is Atzmus is what I told you in the Shiur of Sunday. The Rebbe Marash says is a different dich allein. And the different dich alein is the dich alein that I could feel. The Tzemach Tzedek's dich alein is the Eibush you cannot feel. The Marash dich alein you're able to feel. Look in Order 78. V'yesh loima. The Inyan v'imchalei chafatzti shebeseifa amorim tafish chav zayin huat shuka. What's the next word? Le'erin sof. Taka to Erin sof shekol le'elim is bein reich l'gavei. No question. It's not the level of Ein Sof which is close to me. Could there be Ein Sof which is close to me? There wouldn't be B'chalal Bittel. There would only be Ishapcha, right? But because it's Ein Sof, I'm feeling the Bittel. That's Kaleis HaNefesh. So it's taka quite similar to the Skafia and the Bittel we spoke about in Sunday's Shiur, but the same it's not. Because Soif, Koil, Soif, you're relating to Gilurim, is pailing a bit. In other words, we always understood the Imcha Lechafati. Al Rebbe wants the Eibishter himself. Now we're learning that there's a lower Imcha Lechafati. He wants the highest Madrigas of Ein Sof. The highest Negas of Ein Sof you could feel, but the highest Madrigas of Sof, when you feel them, are going to pale in you a Kaleis HaNefesh. So the Imcha Lechafati of this Maimed is atypical. It's the not normal Imcha Lechafati. The normal Imcha Lechafati, which is the Pshat of the Tzemach Tzedek, in Derech Mitzvah Shesh Mitzvah Perik Mem, which is always brought in Chassidus. I want God. And wanting God, this is the bittul we spoke on Sunday night, Ois Mitzvah. The Reb Marash brings a more sophisticated, the more complex from Chalech Vatzi. I want godliness. Because that I can feel, that gives me a Kaleis HaNefesh, it's going to pale with me a bittul, but a bittul of Aliyah and Eskalos, not a bittul of Ois Mitzvah. So Beklalos, a carbon is the same thing as a bittul. But Bepratius, a carbon is more than a bittul, because a carbon is a bittul ayesh. And the Rebbe brings the word chayfetz and rotz. Chayfetz is called ptimius rotz. Rotzen is called chitenius rotz. And he brings kef and name machem reitzani is rotz. And imchalei chafat means a Jew has a chayfetz, a rotz and pnimi, to be included, not in atzmos, in the highest negative eating. And in case this Maimed has not given you enough chidushim, he brings you one more. He brings a Maimed. From which Rebbe? Teres Menachem Seif Moram Adam and Gimel. From our Rebbe, from himself. It's Mistama Makedis for those. That says there's two in Yonim. There's the Ratzin and there's Chayfetz. The Ratzin is Chitzenius and Chayfetz is Pnimius. Now, the Eibishter created a world, he wants things Bechitzenius and he wants things Bepnimius. What does he want Bechitenius? And what does he want Bepnimius? For what is there a Ratzin and for what is there a chayfetz? And the answer is, what he wants, the chitzonius, is that we should become batal to the Eibush. Our become batal to the Eibush is Ratz. What he wants, bepnimius, which is called chayfetz, is that we should bring the Eibush down. So normally, we associate chayfetz with this hapchen. We associate chayfetz with v'asol l'midish shechanti b'seicham. We associate chayfetz with making yourself into a keli for l'kus. Says the Rebbe not over here. When the Alter Rebbe said v'imcha leicha fatzich vilma nistas dich alein, and according to the Rebbe Marash, this dich alein made the highest madrigas of Ein Sof kum tois. That in contrast to other maimon that say that the kavanah is only did b'tachteinim, in this maimon we're saying that it's possible that the kavanah, the chayfetz, the pnimius of Ratzon Elyon, could be for his kals and bittul t'mimish. In other words, it's a steer between one maimon and the next. In other maimonim it says, you want to do what you want, run to the Eibishter. You want to do what the Eibishter wants, bring him down into this world. But this maimon is saying, no, you want to do what the Eibishter wants, run to the Eibishter. What is the Eibishter? This maimon, not Atzmus, but the highest madrigas of Gilui. And of course, the Rebbe concludes the maimon by stating, which is a very important point, which the Frierdiker makes in his maimon as well, that when a person brings a carbon, so on Sunday night, the carbon was complete bittul, to Atzmus Mamash. On Tuesday night, tonight, the bittul is to the Gilui, Rizak Alis, and Nefesh, with certain upliftedness and inclusiveness and so forth and so on. But Tiazei, where the person is mevatel himself to the Eibush, is mevatel also to Nefesh HaBahamas. And the Nefesh HaBahamas is transformed. Especially when you do avodas on such a level that the Nefesh HaBahamas can relate to. And this is also a very, very, very important part of this conversation. That when you do the avodah of a korban, you're not only being mild in Nefesh HaLokis, but mild in Nefesh HaBahamas. Adasa de Maimer. Tonight's shiur was much glatter than the previous shiur. Much glatter. Why? Because in the Maimer it's much glatter. And in the Bilti Mugge it's also much glatter. Sunday night shiur was very complicated because in the Maimer it's written very complicated.